So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar tonight, Reconciliation in Education. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would first like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we live, work, and gather. As we are all gathering virtually, we are coming together from across the country and from different nations. On behalf of Oxfam UQ, the Responsibility Student Coalition, and UQ Geography and Environmental Management Society, I would like to acknowledge the custodians of different lands on which most of us are gathering, and for those of us who are meeting on the north and south side of Meanjin in the home of Turrabal and Yuggera, we pay our deep respects to all elders past, present and future, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are either with us tonight as panelists or as audience members. I also acknowledge that this is stolen land that has not yet been ceded. So first off, I'd just like to make a few Zoom housekeeping announcements. As we'd like this to run smoothly and avoid any glitches, you will notice that your video and audio functions have been turned off. If this isn't the case, I ask you keep your microphones on mute and your cameras off during the main panel session. This event is also being recorded for future viewing. If you have any questions throughout this discussion, please type them into the chat box and we will ask your questions in order that they're submitted during the Q&A session a little bit later. So on to sort of like our main event for the night. We're so fortunate to have three amazing panelists joining us tonight to talk about why reconciliation in education is important and how reconciliation should be delivered across Australia. So we'll start with some preset questions and then we'll open it up to the floor. So this event was originally scheduled to be held during Reconciliation Week in May, and we decided to hold the event until now in light of like recent events. And this coming week is also the original NAIDOC week, which has been moved to sort of like to November due to COVID-19. So to start off, we'd like to invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves, where you are coming from, what your role is, and what reconciliation means to you. So I think we'll start with Lyndon, and then we'll go to Jordan, and then to Mary.
Thank you, Jen. My name is Lyndon Murphy. I'm a University fellow. I'm obviously just northwest of Brisbane. I teach. I'm an academic, or I try to be. Well, I haven't been thrown out yet, but anyways, I do try to teach. And I teach at Southern Cross University. Teach a couple of courses in Aboriginal politics and history. And I'm also been actually working on a thesis for a number of years, but it's basically titled "In the Company of Colonisers: Hunting and Gathering Aboriginal Politics in White Australia." That's what I'm working on at the moment. And with reconciliation in what it means, I'll probably take a little bit of maybe a different view in parts. I know in the literature of the council, in terms of how it puts it out, we've got this idea of recognition and respect, and all of that is, it's important to aim for, understanding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, culture, and also the ideas of contributions that these people have made to mainstream Australia. But there is a part which it will come out more in my questions as we move through the discussion tonight, and it's the idea of neutral and what we mean by this idea of neutral. Because I will take a part of a view where simply cross-cultural, participation doesn't necessarily mean a cross-cultural exchange, and it's that aspect that I will engage or, try to. That's what I talk to in this ideas of reconciliation and what we can try to do and what it provides an opportunity for. Yeah.
Okay, my turn. Hi, my name is Jordan Pole. I'm a Wiradjuri, Yimba, Buckinji woman from New South Wales. I'm currently living up on Yuggera country. So, Jen, you said a beautiful acknowledgement of country before. I'll just quickly acknowledge the elders of the Yuggera Nation. I'm very lucky that I get to live up here. For the past 4 years, I've been a primary classroom teacher and Aboriginal education coordinator in Perth, actually. And in the last 6 months, I've moved over to the East Coast, up to Yuggera country on the Gold Coast, and I'm working as an Aboriginal and learning support teacher in Tweed Heads at a primary school. Reconciliation to me means, or when I think of reconciliation, I think of two groups coming together to heal a relationship. And when I looked up the actual definition of the word, it did say the restoration of friendly relations. And I'm a little bit cautious to rely solely on that definition, because I don't believe that there was friendly relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to begin with. But I do believe that it's something that we can work on together, and that's what Reconciliation Week and throughout the year, not just limited to Reconciliation Week, that's what it means to me and what I try to emphasise in at school.
Thanks, Lyndon and Jordan. So honoured to be on this panel alongside both of you. My name is Mary Maslina Harm. I'm a proud South Pacific Islander woman living on Turrabal country, so North Brisbane. My dad is full Chinese but was born and raised in Fiji, and my mum is from Samoa, from the village of Satawa. I've lived in Brisbane from a very young age and have been blessed to call this part of Brisbane home. So like Jordan, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am joining you all from, the land of the Turrabal people. As a Pacifica woman fighting for the rights to my own land, I really stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and in their fight for sovereignty, because that is so core to this discussion of reconciliation. For me, reconciliation is about creating a togetherness that promotes equality and that kind of feeling of no one being left behind. And it's about storytelling, it's about truth telling, and it's about this beautiful, well, can be beautiful conversation about what we want our future to be like and how that can look like, especially for young people. So yep, thank you for having me, Oxfam UQ. Really excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you all so much. We're so privileged that you guys took some time out of your Friday night to join us. And sort of going off from what Mary was saying at the end, what do you guys feel, what do you guys consider to be the greatest limitations in Australia's education system when it comes to reconciliation and engaging young people? I guess we'll start with Jordan, because you are a teacher, and then Lyndon and Mary, if you guys want to join in afterwards.
Okay, well, I suppose one of the biggest limitations of reconciliation is limiting it to Reconciliation Week, which is just 1 week every year. I said earlier when I introduced myself that I'm really passionate about making sure that that conversation continues throughout the year and in a meaningful way. I speak a lot on my social media platform about moving beyond symbolic lessons and activities with our young fellas, because I feel like everybody, or teachers, non-Indigenous teachers, need, how can I put this, maybe don't feel confident to talk about or to tell the truth of our history. Perhaps they weren't taught it themselves at school. And I think that's the first step, as well as being honest about our shared history in the past 200 years. And for teachers to do that, it requires self-education and seeking that knowledge yourself before you can confidently translate that to students.
Yeah, no, I would certainly agree with that in terms of what Jordan has been saying, because the idea in terms of, for reconciliation, understanding that idea of history, and it is a shared history, and people tend to, I mean, like with some historians, we'll get views where we tend to look at this, like Greece, for example, who would argue and get people to consider things that happen to Aboriginal people. And what this does is it actually isolates the relationship that exists between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. But more importantly, what it does, it sort of evicts or puts into the void the sorts of ideas that colonisation was actually applying at the time in which this history was being conducted. You know, so it's about creating spaces. I mean, for me, you know, the opportunity that reconciliation can offer, and within education, is the idea to actually be reflective upon the ideas that came with boat people to this country, and to move away from, I think, more the sort of the physical and overt practices or applications of what they did with those ideas. There's a real distinction there, and I don't think we differentiate those distinctions often enough. But I think reconciliation can offer that opportunity to be reflective about what we think we know. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with Jordan and Lyndon. And apologies, I didn't even mention what I do in my intro. I'm a Pacific Liaison Officer at a local college up here on the north side. And I guess part of my job is to continue these conversations of reconciliation. And I agree with Jordan in that it shouldn't be just given a week. Like, this should be an ongoing, everyday kind of conversation that we should be having with our young people. And education plays a role in creating spaces, like Lyndon said, and creating safe and culturally safe spaces for young people and community to continue these conversations. It's so important. I know growing up here in Brisbane, I didn't have space for those conversations when I was in school. It was a very different climate at the time. You know, I was probably one of few people of color at my school. This conversation was almost forbidden. It wasn't a thing to do. It was, no one would understand it. So I'm really happy that the conversation is happening now, but it needs to happen at a faster pace because too much is happening. We've got too many young people that are failing at the system, or the system is failing our young people, sorry, I should say. So yeah, I just want to, I guess, echo what Jordan and Lyndon are saying, and that there's a lots of potential that reconciliation can bring, and it deserves more than just a week.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. I think a common theme picked on all three of your responses was the need to sort of educate ourselves and to be reflective about our past. I know Australia is in a very unique place. We had the history wars occur where there was a lot of denial around what happened in the past and how you know, how extreme frontier violence and how extreme sort of legislative measures and the stolen generations, that was all sort of denied. And you can sort of see that coming into our education system today, where, you know, like, you don't really learn that sort of things. So I guess my next question is, how influential is the exclusion of Indigenous forms of knowledge, cultures and histories in our education systems and in discourses in forming a barrier in terms of engaging young people in education, and then beyond that, in terms of engaging them to and prompting them to pursue higher education?
All right then. Well, I think one of the biggest challenges there for me, and part of it came up in the idea that Mary raised in her first talk about this idea of telling stories. I think that becomes really sort of important. But just in terms of this idea for young people, if I can just go back 30 years, I can remember when I was sitting in the lecture theatres there at UQ with you know, a group of Maoris that, you know, we were also studying there at the time. And I think one of the most common, I suppose, feeling or characters or presence of our learning in that particular space is that when people started talking about Aboriginal people, we didn't know who they were talking about. because they weren't talking to the experiences that we had. You know, we didn't, there was a really uncomfortable fit in terms of what was being taught in the books and what we had experienced through actualities. So that was one part. But for me, the biggest challenge, I think, is that not to be, and it took me a while to learn this. I had a good mentor, but not to be defined by the experiences of colonialism. Because if I see myself through the deficits and through the effects of that particular exercise and practice, then what I end up doing is I'm telling someone else's story. Because my experience is born out from the perceptions of someone else's interpretation or assessment or perception of what I should be doing. You know, I mean, like for me, just for me personally, I mean, I come from 4 generations of removals. My earliest memories are nursery and Nudgee orphanage. So those sorts of experiences of growing up in state institutions till I was 15 is not my story, even though I'm a participant in it. It is not my story. But if I carry that with me and in terms of the deficits that accumulate from it, then I actually cede my ownership. I have no authority. I'm not a subject in this narrative. You know, so for me, the biggest thing I think that, you know, when I talked before, reconciliation gives an opportunity, provides an opportunity for reflection. It's that sort of reflection, you know, that I can move away from the effects of our history and actually begin to start engaging with issues of causality. And I think that's what reconciliation should be about.
Okay, again, I'll just bring all of my yarns back to primary school teaching, because that's what I do and that's my experience. And what I see in the classroom today, or in the last couple of years, is a difference in how children are taught about life and hunting, or you know, contemporary living as well, and just the strategies in which parents teach their kids these through hands-on experiences and things like that. You only need to take one look at the In My Blood It Runs documentary. That's I don't know if anyone else has watched it, but the little boy Juan, I think is how you say his name, he really struggles with adapting to the classroom, where he is surrounded, of course, by children of other cultures, and there's Aboriginal boys and girls in there too. But the way in which the teachers are teaching about our shared history and ignoring, I suppose, what has happened in the past 200 years, when Juan and his family have been talking about that in their home, about what has happened and learning and teaching in hands-on ways. I suppose I can imagine how some Aboriginal students, and by no means do I mean all Aboriginal students, but some Aboriginal students, how 5 hours a day indoors, a completely different existence to traditional Aboriginal routines that continue for many to this day. And Juan, by the way, is from a remote community in Australia, so it's different for urban communities, of course, but being taught the ways of another culture with hardly any hands-on learning or Aboriginal teaching strategies in place, watching all of his peers succeed somewhat easily through each lesson because they're more familiar with schools and the hidden curriculum, and their home lives often reflect the school environment much more. And your own culture, which you're very proud of course, and the culture of this land since the beginning of time, is completely ignored in the classroom. The time you spent with your family on the weekends and outside of school is full of practical learning experiences, mostly outdoor, in a language that you can understand, whether that's Aboriginal English, traditional language, Creole. and you can see the relevance of everything that you're learning. You know, hunting is to get food. Of course, I can just completely understand how some students are in the classroom and really struggling with this change of ways of being taught and what's being taught. So back to the question, what are some barriers for children? I suppose, well, number one, I suggest everyone watches the In My Blood It Runs documentary so you know what I'm referring to, but there are barriers in how non-Indigenous teachers teach the curriculum, I suppose. And there is a priority in the Australian curriculum to embed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures and perspectives across all subjects. And on paper, it says that we need to differentiate our teaching to meet the needs of all students. So that would include researching and using Aboriginal teaching strategies. But at the moment, I'm not, just in my experience, I haven't seen that those used to their full potential, because on paper, of course, they sound amazing, but that's a barrier that I'm seeing at the moment in the classroom.
Yeah, not too much extra to add to what Lyndon and Jordan have so eloquently put, but I think what's lacking is that our education system doesn't realize the importance of, or what the role of culture plays in nurturing a young person's life. Just speaking of my own experience as a Pacifica person living away from our ancestral homelands, a lot of our culture when we move to another country is somewhat lost in terms of figuring out who are we, how do we identify ourselves as Pacifica people living away from home. And this unlearning and learning again and then relearning journey is continuous. And I feel for a lot of our young Pacifica students, this identity struggle is really hard. It makes it really hard to navigate the system. And I feel, as what Jordan has said, you know, learning things that are relevant, kind of like in our language, not in particular language, but, you know, just metaphorically in our language is so important in having these conversations. And when I was young in school, this conversation of reconciliation wasn't a thing, like I mentioned. I feel if I had that then, tertiary education would have been a lot different. And being able to kind of use my voice and use my passions to contribute meaningfully to this conversation of reconciliation would be so much easier. So if I could add anything to what they've said, that's probably what I would say.
No, thank you. I think following on from that, so like you guys mentioned like a number of challenges in terms of like embedding Indigenous knowledges into the curriculum. So I guess like how do you think we can sort of better integrate Indigenous knowledges and cultures and education into the curriculum, into the school curriculum, or somehow reform the education system in such a way that we are more respectful and more accommodating of culture, and instead of just ignoring it?
I definitely think that Jordan touched on this earlier, in educating yourself, like doing the extra work, outside work, to make sure that you're informed so then you can then inform your students or your community. That's really, really important. Diversity in the workplace is also so important. Representation is so important as well. So, you know, you can't find meaning in who you are and your place in the world if you don't see people like you or people who have stories like you already navigating through the world that you live in. So I think it's really important to have culturally responsive educators, diverse workplaces that represent your student body. So, so important. And making sure that young people have a say in the creation of curriculum or in the creation of programs. I think that's really important. As a Pacific Liaison Officer, I constantly ask my students, you know, what would make you feel like you belong more on this campus? You know, what do you want to see? How do you want to be celebrated? I think that conversation is so important in giving students the power to also choose what education journey they want to take. It's about togetherness. It's not about us versus them. And I think those conversations are really important. But I think Jordan and Lyndon will probably have more practical ideas on how we can make this more of a reality.
I so agree with what you said, Mary, about diverse staffing. I mean, I agree with everything that you've said, but something that resonates with my own teaching journey so far has been diverse staffing, and the fact that I have in both school settings, I've been the only First Nations staff member on site. So with the majority of other teachers being from, I suppose, English, European, heritage, Caucasian. And so I think it is really important to have diverse staffing that represents the students in the school 100%, because, you know, teachers are great at have been great asking me questions for my advice for teaching certain topics, and, you know, finding resources. But that can be a lot if every other staff member is asking that of me as the only Indigenous person on staff. So yes, that's something I'm going to remember, make note of. I already have on my phone. That's diverse staffing is really important. As for, I've sort of thought about this really in a specific way to teaching in a primary school, of course, and things that I've seen work really well, because remember, embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures and perspectives should be in all subjects, and it should be regularly throughout the year. So some things that I've seen that have worked really well has been when classes learn about an acknowledgement of country, and specifically what country means to Aboriginal people, and working together to create an acknowledgement of country for the lands that they're on, that they've created together, students together with the teacher, and something that you don't necessarily need to recite it every morning, but perhaps, you know, there is one student each day who could stand up and say, you know, their acknowledgement of country from their heart. And I've also seen a yarning circle every morning work really well. So everybody sits in a circle, and the teacher has a great opportunity to check in with every student. And in fact, it doesn't even need to be teacher run, because, you know, a yarning circle, when everyone sits in a circle, everyone has the same responsibility in that circle, I suppose. No one is above anyone else in the circle. And consulting with your local Aboriginal community, I honestly cannot stress this enough. In New South Wales, we're really lucky. We have an AECG that works alongside the Department of Education, and that is an Aboriginal education consultative group. So they can provide advice directly to teachers and principals in regards to Aboriginal education. So something I've seen work really well has been to learn the traditional numbers, words for numbers, if there are any, like for numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, some Aboriginal groups don't have numbers for over 5. It just, the next number would mean many. But learning how to say those with your local language speakers, I suppose, and using those to count down or count up like you would with any other numbers. I mean, I'm always counting, you know, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, sit down on the mat. You know, learning to say those with permission, of course, from your local community, and that's something that you can do all the time. And I'll just touch on a couple because I don't want to be talking for this whole time, but decolonising your bookshelf in your classroom. How many books are in there that, you know, represent people with darker skin and are written by First Nation authors? So I often, when I'm in, classrooms at my school, I sort of look around at all the books, and most of the characters or the people in the books are, of course, from the dominant culture, because there's lots of reasons. They're very accessible, but there are books by Indigenous authors, and they should be on your bookshelf, available for students to look at and to read every single day. And another good resource, I'll just drop it here and then I'm done. I'll pass it on to Lyndon, there is an Australian curriculum science document for Foundation to Year 10. For every outcome that we need to teach in science, there is a recommended elaboration or how to include an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective for that outcome. And then for each elaboration, there are pages of teacher notes that explain to you what that means, and then it's up to the teacher then to go and find resources and to continue to learn about that, so that they can convey that to their students. So there is so many ways that you can bring in our Aboriginal cultures and histories and Torres Strait Islander into the classroom. But yeah, it comes up to the teacher, self-education, and diverse staffing helps.
Okay, I can only add just a few little things there, but most of the time when we start talking about embedding Indigenous knowledge, the issues and frustrations that I've experienced are predominantly at university level. Though there have been some where in the 90s, when I was working with ATSIC and Discovering Democracy, was trying to get into this was all part of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, and Discovering Democracy was trying to really sort of push this idea of Aboriginal histories within it. But a lot of the questions, or what the issues I raised with the group that was drafting this curriculum was the assumptions they were making about the idea of democracy being really relevant and open to the experiences and recognitions of Aboriginal people. I kind of like question that, because that, as I mentioned a bit earlier, that came with boat people. That was a political system that we weren't very democratic in that regard. So this was something that was introduced, and we are asked to play within those spaces. So if we play within those political relationships that are set up by that colonising logic, we then have to find and try to understand who exactly are we when we want to position ourselves as Aboriginal people, as subjects in our own right, where we can name and define ourselves in those particular practices. So those sorts of issues were things that I couldn't make any headway. People just refused to engage with that sort of stuff. And when I was working at Griffith, I worked at Griffith for 16 years. So the issue, probably I spent at least 8 years, I was on part of a committee which was embedding Indigenous knowledge in curriculum, but it had very little to do with Indigenous knowledge. It was most of it was about Indigenous content, talked about within the frames and borders and limitations that the disciplines within the university was providing. And it was something there, and I used to do it even when I was at UQ as a student. One of the things I would say during the orientations to new students coming in, I would say this institution has a primary task to reproduce knowledge. And I would say, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, one of your primary aims is to understand whose knowledge they reproduce. And this way, it's about keeping or trying to. And it is difficult, but really trying to maintain the integrity of what it is that you bring into these places. You can then have the options of making those changes, but let the conclusions be your own and not just simply imposed, and don't see yourself, outside of or in the making of others, so to speak. But yeah, embedding is a difficult task. And we've seen it practiced within the universities here in the southeast corner, and it's been very difficult for all of them to to do it in a manner which can be considered, I think, satisfactory by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
No, thank you. Yeah, I definitely do feel that, because it took me until I think about my second semester, and it was through an extracurricular event that I found out that yarning existed, and that was a thing. So before that, I had never heard about it before. So yeah, definitely, there's still there's progress being made, but we still have a way to go with that one. There's been a few questions in the chat room, so I think we might go. So I think the first question comes from Denise Gibbons, and they ask, would it help to have reconciliation as part of the Indigenous curriculum? So I think educating all students about reconciliation, what it means, and probably within like a school context and maybe even beyond that.
Okay, so should we talk about reconciliation regularly throughout the year? Is that the question? Like
I think maybe. It just says, would it help to have it as part of the Indigenous curriculum? And I think just, yeah, probably because constant discussions within, rather than just limiting it to 1 week.
Okay, yeah, because I don't actually think in the curriculum it says to teach specifically about reconciliation. There's a part in the Year 3 curriculum, I'm pretty sure, that teaches that is about celebrations in Australia and around the world, and so I suppose reconciliation as a significant event for Aboriginal people next to NAIDOC Week and things like that is there, but should it actually be stated in the curriculum? Yeah, that's a tough one. I think yeah, I don't know how to answer that. Should it be in the curriculum? I mean, I think I've definitely said from the beginning we should be talking about it, and not even you know, regularly referring back to Reconciliation Week or reconciliation, but just we should be working towards it throughout the year and sharing a truer history and things like that. So if it would help teachers to remember to do that, if it was explicitly said in the curriculum, then I'm sure that would be a good thing.
Yeah, I like the idea, particularly in terms of what Jordan was just talking about sharing the history, and I think that part of it is really important. But there can be a difficulty there, I mean, in the phrasing where within the question where it talked about reconciliation within the Indigenous curriculum. Reconciliation, I believe, is not an Indigenous knowledge matter. I mean, it's not sourced in that space. And reconciliation does talk about, you know, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, this idea of respect and recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, culture, their contributions to society. And that's the key part here. Because when we talk about this idea of recognition and respect, it's basically framed within a status that sees Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as citizens of the state. And it's looking for this sense of respect and recognition that is situated only within that status. Now, when Aboriginal people place themselves within that particular status as citizen, the only rights and entitlements that I can receive as an Aboriginal person is that which come from the state. What I do is I lose my status as actually being an Aboriginal person, and my relationship upon that status to the state is very different. I've never ceded my sovereignty. I own this country, or in this parts of this country, and I know I'll take that to my grave. But I'll have no legitimacy by the state that will recognise that. Native title isn't, you know, can't do that, because native title comes from an introduced European common law. You know, so it's only when I abide by the criteria of that new law that I get native title. And its weakest form of land tenure, you can you can have. So the danger for me there is to consider that reconciliation is not, for me, it is not about Indigenous knowledge or recognising Indigenous people as Indigenous people in their own essence. Reconciliation places Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a status that sees them as citizens of the state, and it's within that relationship that we talk to. So when we talk about issues of equality, we talk about issues of equality that exist within the state, not as my presence of actually being an Aboriginal person in terms of what rights I have over the country. Those sorts of things. That they're discussions that we are yet to have in this country, but maybe one day we will. Yeah.
I guess sorry.
Oh, I just saw in the chat that Denise Gibbons has said, I guess that's what I mean, that respect for your culture and history, as well as just talking about the history and culture.
No, I definitely agree. As an Indigenous person from another land, I don't think a lot of our own people, as Pacific people, realise how intertwined our history is with Indigenous Australia's history. For those who may or may not know about blackbirding, a lot of our Pacifica people were actually stolen from the Pacific and forced to work on cane fields here in Queensland. And we have a whole population now of South Sea Islanders, and that history has also not been told to our own people. And so I think, to echo what Denise has said, that it's about talking about history and culture, and making sure that we all know the true history that has happened, and we continue to acknowledge it and do better.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So we do have another question from the audience, and I think it probably would be best answered by Jordan, but I think Mary could probably give a little 2 cents. So it's from Judith, who's a primary school teacher, who says, I believe in relationships with students and parents. Have you any suggestions on how to make connections with parents to make them feel welcomed and valued?
Okay. I always start the year off by making sure that I reach out to all parents, of course, but specifically with my Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander parents, I don't sort of jump down their throat with all of this school jargon and information and attendance and the rules and uniform and, all of those things. I'll just have a casual yarn with them and get to know them as people, talk about their child in a talk about the personality of their child that I've seen so far, and what I'm enjoying about having them in my class. And I find that they really appreciate that, and perhaps it's because in the past they have experienced teachers, or it could have been in their own education as well, but not some teachers maybe not taking the time to get to know them, and or always perhaps only phoning or wanting to have a conversation with them when something's gone wrong. So that's how I start off the relationship, in a casual way, and then I always like to try and bring up some highlights as well. So if little Ziggy has said something really funny in the afternoon, or he did, he helped someone, and I noticed it, I'll bring that up in the conversation and let them know that I see their child in my classroom. I don't know, Mary, can you add to that? That's sort of how I would start the year, definitely.
Yeah, no, definitely I agree, Jordan, especially the point when you mentioned only calling when something bad has happened. I think that's really important. Like, I think young people the young people that I work with are such resilient, strong-minded young people. And it pains me that the only contact that family get is when they may have mucked up or they may have made a mistake. Because when you look at it from a bigger view, they have so many little achievements along the way as well that fail to get recognized. And you can see how like over like 12 years of education or 12 years of schooling, that can be really disempowering. So I think, yeah, Jordan made a perfect point in making sure that parents are also aware of like the little achievements that their child has made at school. That's really, really important. And it's, I think, just about building genuine rapport. Talk to parents as if they were your elders, as if they were your parents. I think a lot of families in the school that I work with have experienced being talked down to, or being talked to by condescending staff members who fail to see their wisdom as Indigenous people themselves. I think it's really important that we acknowledge the wisdom that parents bring into our communities. It may be different wisdom than that of our school, but to always acknowledge that they too have a powerful role to play in raising a generation of young, fearless young people.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, yeah, just having conversations, laughing. I mean, when I call my parents up, we joke about things that we've seen, or, you know, we talk about the recent movie that's been released, or something that's happened back home with one of our like villages. And it's just about like being real people. I think that we overcomplicate things. We just want to have real talk, be real, cry, laugh, just be normal.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, there are some sort of cultural protocols that can be helpful to know of. And I know like the Department of Education for New South Wales and lots of other organisations have prepared documents that a simple Google search, like communicating with, they probably use the word Indigenous parents and families or something like that, will bring up some of these documents where you can read about some of the protocols that that can be helpful in these conversations, but you don't need to overthink them. It's about getting to, you know, just talking to them as people, but it is helpful to have, you know, be aware of some of the cultural protocols.
Thank you for that. We did have another question as well. So this follows on sort of what you were talking before with, you know, watch In My Blood It Runs, which is free on ABC iView. Are there any other resources that any of you would recommend to help educate or spread awareness of Australia's histories or about reconciliation?
I don't know. I mean, there's... within the semester, I mean, I'm currently teaching at the moment, and I know I like to use a quote just to, you know, well, I seem just to play with heads, because I think that's my job. But it comes from Maitland. He's a legal theorist from the 19th century, and he makes the comment that within history, it's not the events themselves in history that are important, but it's what people said or thought about it. So here we get this really very subjective nature about history. And I think when we opened up this morning, we heard some of that come through. I can't remember if it was Mary or Jordan that raised the idea of those particular histories. But that little opportunity to reflect on, you know, if you know that there is this subjective element, or is that there can be a bias within the way in which we may tell or describe our histories, then that is another perfect opportunity upon which we can walk away and actually not look for right or wrong, but actually look, I can understand this history better, you know, knowing that it's not just about you know, just because you become aware of that subjective nature that actually sits inside it, you know. So, and I use the idea with students in particular that if you change your understanding of history, then you've actually changed it. It's not static. It's all about how you change your interpretation of what you think you know. And so long as you can embrace having a really reflective practice towards your understanding of this history, and which helps to create an understanding of yourself, it's all fine, you know. Everything can only be better, you know, in terms of on how you perceive. You can just get more content, I think, with knowing who you are.
I think also probably before like maybe the 1990s, a lot of the textbooks and just books in general that were more readily available and used in classrooms were very shared a very whitewashed view of our history, which we've brought up a couple of times already tonight. But I think it's really important to hear the voices of First Nations people. So if you want to learn about what happened from the other perspective, of course, which is our First Nations voice, then you need to buy books, which of course supports the authors and the bookshops, by First Nations peoples. An example is for Anzac Day, I wanted to make sure that I included an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective on that, and just remind everybody that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women have fought alongside other Australians in every war that Australia has participated in. So there's a book called Our Mob Served that I purchased, and it has stories from Aboriginal servicemen and women and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women as well, of course, from the Vietnam War and so on. And this is just going back to my comment about decolonising your bookshelf, really, and making sure that you are purchasing books, reading websites, accessing knowledge that is written by First Nations peoples.
I love that. I think another great resource would be just your own local mob. Like, look out for events, especially. We have like amazing young, like Indigenous artists, creatives that are making amazing spaces that invite such a plethora of other peoples and communities. And I think if you make an effort to attend those events, to support them, because like again with Jordan, like this is supporting them and their communities too. That is a great resource to learn how things are done, how they should be done, how they can be done, and how you can contribute meaningfully in that conversation as well. So yeah, I would say turn up to events. If you can, turn up to rallies, to protests. Whenever Indigenous people call out, be there. Do the hard work, learn, educate yourselves, and yeah, just create space and create more spaces for voices like Jordan, like Lyndon, who deserve space to share what the amazing wisdoms they have and experiences they have too.
And actually that point links back to when we were yarning about relationships with families. If you are turning up to events and supporting us in the community, and your families from your Aboriginal students are there and they see that, they're going to appreciate that, your support, and see that it's not tokenistic, it's not just a little check the box lesson that you did the other week about Reconciliation Week for just one lesson. So that can really help with your relationships with your community as well. And from there, so many great connections you can make, and just building those relationships that you can ask for advice when you need it and whatnot. Yeah.
So we've run out of time for questions, but sort of where you guys ended answering that, it sort of leads really well into like the final question that I want to ask. So in addition to everything that you guys have already mentioned, so buying books from First Nation authors and attending local events, and educating yourself and creating a space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, as a non-Indigenous person, how else can we be allies for First Nation students? And I guess this question is more to Lyndon and to Jordan.
Well, the first thing that I would say, we're getting close, so I'll be very quick. And I'd say this to students that enter into my classroom is simply know yourself. just simply know yourself. By that I mean, don't use the filters that you have to protect yourself, which actually sustains any fear of a difference in terms of how you experience. Because when you use your filters and you come into something which is uncomfortable, those filters incite basically an imagined fear. Not a fear that exists, but that fear that you imagine comes from within you. So I try to encourage students to actually experience a difference for as it exists, not as they imagine it. And to do that, basically, one of the things that I think can help people in this regard is that if the aspirations, benefits and desires and investments that you see for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are those same aspirations, investments and desires you see for yourself, then you're not seeing me. Okay? You're not seeing me at all. And it's that sort of projection. If you can control that, good, because then you'll be able to see me as I am, and you'll be able to have that opportunity to engage in an essence that exists outside of those imaginations, those filters you use. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I always encourage my colleagues to self-reflect in a very honest way, and they don't need to share those reflections with anybody else, but to really think about how they have perhaps absorbed stereotypes or opinions from their own families or what they've seen on the media. And the first step to truly being open-minded to any of this is to, like you said, Lyndon, to know who you are and deep down. So, and to consider those things that you've picked up along the way, and whether they're useful or a barrier to you being a true ally, which links back to the question. And I, on top of having decolonised your classroom resources, I had just a little tiny tip about addressing casual racism when it occurs in the classroom, but also at your dinner table, in your home, with your families. Being an ally doesn't need to be only something that you do publicly on social media or in front of an audience. It needs to occur when you hear casual comments or a joke, I say that with inverted commas, about First Nations people, is to I consider an ally, or what I would appreciate in an ally is being able to call out, but I don't mean in an aggressive way, of course, but to speak up, when you hear those casual racist comments or microaggressions, they've been called as well. And then when you hear your students say, little things like that, to actually stop, pause, dissect that. What did you mean by that? That, and you discuss that with your students, because often a lot of the comments that I hear young kids say, they don't even really understand what it is that they've just said. It's something that they've heard from someone else. So, and I'll just finish off with a quote that I saw from Yatu Widder's Hunt, and she said, "Open your heart and listen. We have been talking to you forever." And that's so true. If you look at literature by First Nations people, or films or documentaries, plays, they have, been made and shared for a very, very long time. People have been telling their stories. Indigenous people have been telling their stories for a long time, but you need to open your heart and you need to listen to that. They're there.
No, thank you. Well, it's time to wrap up now. So I'd just like to invite all our viewers and our audience to join me, giving like a virtual applause for our audience. I think there's like a clapping emoji you can do.
There he is.
Yeah, so thank you so much to Lyndon, Jordan and Mary for taking time out of your Friday night to join us tonight. And thank you for having this really important conversation with us. Thank you also to UQ GEM's UQ Responsibility to Protect Student Coalition for partnering with us. Also a reminder to all our audience members is that we're still running the fundraiser for First Nations, where we are gathering donations for the Healing Foundation and for the Indigenous Literacy Foundation, which are two organisations that are working hard to challenge systems of oppression and discrimination in Australia. We'll post that link on the event as well as other resources that come up. So for anyone in the audience or our panel tonight has any useful resources they want to share, they're welcome to post on the page. As well, this event is also recorded, so that link will be up and running when that's all sorted and done. So I just thank you everyone and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.